Here is proof that failing prisons can be transformed. It's a remarkable story that we've never told about the transformation of a failing English local prison through dialogue. In just a couple of years, it was transformed from the worst culture and performance ever seen by the Inspector of Prisons to the highest levels of performance and quality of prison life. The prison was formally recognised as the most improved in the country. Our recent podcast, A New Kind of Dialogue, led to the ex-prison governor Steve Holland getting in touch with us, and then to this interview about our first ever prison transformation. Transforming this prison revealed the extraordinary power of dialogue, and it set the pattern for our work over the next 20 years. From there, we went on to transform larger prisons and whole prison systems. Do you think you could transform a whole statewide correctional system in this way? Well, in the United States, we did just that. I hope you enjoyed listening to the interview.
This is Peter Garrett, Steve Holland and Jane Ball, 12th of April 2024. We're wanting to put on record a story of some significance. People like dialogue because it enhances the relationships between people. What they often overlook is the impact on performance, on delivery, on the effectiveness of an organization. We have examples in probably 10 or 12 different situations where not only the relationships change, but the performance changed significantly. I want to take one of those, and this is partnership with Steve Holland, who was the head of residence at Long Light in 1977, I think. We did a little bit of work there, which is what I call intervention work, a clear problem, violence on a wing, opening a new wing and so on. But it was when in due course he went to Dorchester that we worked on what we call a whole prison turnaround, systemic work. And so that's what we want to make a recording of today, is what happened in HMP Dorchester when Steve was governor there, and Jane led a piece of change work on behalf of Prison Dialogue with support from Sarah Hill and Vince Miller and others.
This was my first prison. I got a phone call on the way home to see if I would be interested in becoming the governor of Dorchester. But as I think we're probably going to go on and discuss, it was a prison with considerable problems.
What did you know about Dorchester, Steve, before you arrived?
In 1999, the prison was inspected, and the chief inspector of prisons said it was the worst culture that he'd ever come across of any prison. And he said every intervention is met with resistance by the Prison Officers Association. Industrial relations were absolutely dreadful. So it was a damning inspection report. On top of that, the prison service had just started to measure performance, and one of the indicators that it used to measure performance was what it called the weighted scorecard, and that was a whole series of different measures that were given different weightings, and then a league table was assembled. And of the 135 prisons in England and Wales then, Dorchester was 135th. So there was a huge job to be done, obviously, to improve the performance, because one of the things that the government had introduced and that the National Offender Management Service were pursuing was market testing. And so those prisons which were deemed not to be performing sufficiently well under a public ownership the threat was that they'd be put open for tender in the market so that the private sector could bid to run them. So they'd all be closed. So that was the threat that was hanging over Dorchester. If it didn't improve, either it would be just closed or that it would be put on the market to see if anybody from the private sector wanted to take it on to run it. The incumbent governor, who'd only been there, I think, for about 2 years, had been told that he was being removed and he was being replaced. So I was to be his replacement. there were issues around his management of the prison, but he was, to all intents and purposes, very popular, and he was very popular with particularly the Board of Visitors and the vicar, strangely, who was also incensed. And on my first day there, came to tell me how angry he was and how inappropriate it was that I was replacing. So, on just about every level, it was a difficult place to take on. It needed a real strong intervention to make some difference. I was a mature guy who knew the world a little bit. I'd worked in the sharp end of policing, so I probably didn't have some of the barriers to break down that other people might have had. I immediately joined the local rugby club, so I was playing rugby with some of the staff. I'd call into the local club and have a drink with people and get to know them socially. I interviewed every member of staff so that to try and find out more about them and their families, and brought down some barriers, I think, and we did start to make some progress.
Jane, what was your memory of first going into the prison? I want to get the feel of the state of the prison.
I think there was a lot of unhappiness in many prisons in the country. So Dorchester was extreme, I know, but still, I think, across the board, there was quite a lot of unhappiness and malcontent, maybe more. The things that stood out for me were two. One was you asked some member of staff to show us around the prison. And as we were being shown around, it was a kind of relaxed, very kind of lots of banter between staff and prisoners. And actually, I remember one of the members of staff saying to me a little bit later, actually, we've got really good relationships with the prisoners here. But the reasons we've got good relationships with them is that we never challenge what they do. But the member of staff we were shown around by kept saying to the prisoners that he couldn't answer their questions because he was the chaplain. So we were thinking, oh, this is nice. The chaplain seems very kind of pleasant chap, And then later on, we discovered he wasn't the chaplain at all. He was a member of the senior management team and just didn't want the prisoners to know the responsibility he had because he didn't want to have to do anything. So that was an interesting insight, I think. But right from the start, you had a really clear vision about wanting to become a resettlement prison. I don't think you arrived just wanting to fix the place. You arrived wanting to make the place quite special. And I think you, right from that start, had the idea that this isn't just about running a good prison. It's about running a prison that is having an impact on people's lives.
But I think the other thing that I would say, just in terms of the general state of the prison, was bear in mind, part of the reason why it had performed so badly was when it was hugely overcrowded. It was a prison that was built for 150 people, but never had less than 270 in it. So it was massively overcrowded. Prisoners were mainly two to a cell, in a cell that was built for one prisoner. So the actual physical conditions that prisoners were in were terrible. There was very little purposeful activity. They were locked up in their cells for long periods of time. There wasn't really a great deal to recommend the place.
So as I understand it, Steve, you arrived at HMP Dorchester late 2002.
Sounds about right.
In the 26 months from 2003, 26 months later, the prison was scored at the highest level it could get for its type in the country. So from the lowest it could be to the highest it could be occurred over a couple of years. How would you describe the difference in the prison? We can talk later about what we did, but what do you think would be the difference for somebody coming into that prison?
People would have gained a view that this was a prison that had a sense of purpose, that it had people who had started to pull in the same direction rather than in opposing directions, and that those plates that had been spinning, but 12 plates spinning and falling off, had probably been reduced down to 3 or 4, and therefore were much more under control than they had been. But I think they would also see that that the relationships between staff and prisoners which had always been convivial, as we've talked about, were becoming more purposeful, and were moving towards an expectation that people needed to be making plans for when they were being released, and that conversations between staff and prisoners needed to be focused around those sorts of things. We planned. It didn't come about as a accident. As you know, I came up to Chipping Campden and I spoke with yourself, and the statistics prove that we went from being, in terms of the weighted scorecard, we went from 135th to 35th. So statistically, the powers that be, the people who were putting pressure on the prison, were happier that it was moving in the right direction. Audits were all very good. So, and the indicators which they were most keen on were moving in the right direction. And then people came to measure things like the management of the quality of prison life, which measures staff satisfaction, it measures prisoner satisfaction, the relationships between the two, how purposeful they were, and towards resettlement and what have you. Scored it the highest it had ever been scored in the country of any prison. One of the problems that if we ever talk about doing anything with the dialogic approach is, well, give us evidence. Where's the empirical evidence that this works? Well, you've got to show statistically what's improving. And statistically, we had lots of things to show that things were improving.
I'd add to your comments, Steve, that because I have the figures in front of me, so the standard score, the overall score for standards was 93%. Only 2 other prisons of 136 in the country had returned more questionnaires.
Did people notice? Did the prison service generally notice what was happening, Steve?
Well, I did have a phone call after the last set of standards assessment before I left from the Director General to say that that the turnaround in the prison had been remarkable, and offered his congratulations.
Perhaps just add a brief story myself. Is the prison was due to be closed or put to the private sector unless something changed. Something did change. The staff were absolutely on board.
Yeah.
Hard to believe the celebration when it was clear that the performance was in place and there was no longer any possibility of closure or being put to the private sector. You might remember, Steve, we had a party.
Yeah.
You invited the staff.
Yeah. 2/3 of the staff got there, and we had a waiting list of about 50 because we could only get a certain number of people in the facility. The staff feeling of self-worth improved dramatically, and they'd been at the bottom of tables for a long time, even before the weighted scorecard. They'd demonstrated that they actually could do something really well, and they were very proud of it. You know, they 2 years after I left, Dorchester was awarded the most improved prison in the country award. So that performance improvement, which started with the arrival of dialogue, continued through to be, achieve that award in 2008. It's a remarkable achievement.
I also think what's important is that everybody had owned a piece of that improvement in every area, be it people working the segregation or in the kitchens or in the resettlement team or, landing officers engaging in a different way with the prisoners. Everybody knew that they had played a part in the improvement.
So you kind of shift from low morale, where people are maybe comfortable but terrible performance, through to an invitation where 2/3 of your staff come out at night to celebrate. I don't know many organisations ever have that experience, where 2/3 of their staff step forward in pride and confidence to enjoy it. So this is a big shift from where it was 2 years previously. Huge. You must feel very proud, Steve, of what you did.
Yeah, I'm proud that I was the person that could act as a catalyst for a change, and probably the medium to drive some things through. But it really is the case, and it's the case with transformational change, that it's not about one individual. It's about selling the vision, I guess, and then allowing people then to pick up the ball and run with it. When that happens, it's like surfing. It's like riding a wave. It's going where it's going. It's a fantastic feeling.
Anything you want to add, Jane? Because we'll pause in a minute and go to what happened, what we did between the two.
I guess the other thing in terms of outcomes was that there was already a move to look outside more. The relationship with the local criminal justice board was really strong, and starting the work that then became the threshold dialogue work had begun at that point as well. It really was kind of shifting the orientation of the whole prison. First of all, internally, to start to look at the success of prisoners in their resettlement, and then starting to look outside to the relationships with the other agencies that could ensure that resettlement was sustained. I brought this with me, which I had at home. Do you remember that, Steve? I don't know what Dorset Justice Awards award winner 2007.
Completely forgotten.
Because we won the kind of for threshold dialogue.
Well done.
We won that. So that was 2000. So at that point, 2007, 5 years after you arrived in Dorchester in the situation we described, and having had the achievements internally through the prison service measures, this was a local criminal justice board award for the external facing work. So that was all within 5 years. Astonishing. I think in terms of the structure of what we did, Steve, one of the foundational things was a cascaded approach. Do you want to say a little bit about what it was like for you bringing a SMT together that could help you to deliver this change?
Yeah, I mean, it was absolutely essential that we had people who, well, basically who could work hard enough as much as anything. Yeah. Jo Mason came over on accelerated promotion, and she took over the resettlement side of things. I then recruited my deputy governor, who set about doing the nuts and bolts, the transactional things that needed to be done in order to satisfy audit. So we got to get the senior management team right. The head of works, for instance, turned out to be a revelation, and Dorchester had been voted the worst prison for Christmas lights 3 years in a row. He said, well, let's change that perception. And he arranged along the Riverside Walk for there to be reindeer, about 30 reindeer, some of which moved, lit up, and it literally was a beacon for the prison, saying some things are changing here. And so that was very encouraging.
Just if I add just a brief observation of my own, Steve, I remember you came, we sat down, Jane and I, with you to talk about the situation. You were running around in circles, and we drew this image of a wagon wheel where you were at the center and every spoke came to you. You had to make every decision every day. And I remember we suggested you change your seating, put your secretary or assistant between you and the rest of the prison, so you started to get some space and actually find the right team. Once you'd found that team, then you could start to act on your vision, which was substantial, I think. You had some who'd been there a while, some who'd been there a short while, and no common history. And without the leadership team understanding the situation, quite hard for them to respect what was happening in the prison and each other. So it was an exercise in respect by looking at history and going back to earlier situations, earlier governors, and working progressively through the different eras, different chapters of history, and understanding staff had been there through all those chapters, so they understood what was happening. And at the end of that, it seemed like your whole team was on board. So there was a cascade then from there, from that small group of that leadership team down through the prison.
So I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about your comply, perform, serve, shine.
I think with anybody, you know, you've got strengths and weaknesses, and I am not a detailed person. So in order for the prison to be successful, we needed somebody who was going to dot the I's and cross the T's. And Steve was absolutely crucial. It's the reason that I wanted him as part of the team, because I've worked with him before, that he covered bases that I didn't. So getting the right people in the right place, you're right, Jen, is absolutely essential. So that comply bit was the first bit that we got right, and that degree provided a degree of assurance. The next bit was about, instead of being somewhere near the bottom of the league table, we needed to demonstrate that we were, in some areas, we were really performing better than similar people in class, in grade. So similar local prisons like ourselves, we were outperforming them. And then the third bit is that I sort of think goes back to what the chief inspector said about the potential for Dorchester to be a community prison, to be a resettlement prison, was that we then needed to engage with our local community and serve it, which we did by the way that we engaged with the Criminal Justice Board and other agencies within Dorchester, Probation Service and what have you. And then finally, as we get to, the ultimate thing of shining was when, we were awarded the most improved prison. So,
and I think that the place in a way that Dialogue had was it enabled that combination of the technical delivery type of expertise that Steve Hodson brought, he exemplified, and the energetic vision that we can do something really meaningful in the world, that I think you probably exemplify, and kind of bring that together so everybody feels that they're part of that. And also that everybody knew what everybody else was doing. I was thinking that there was a real transparency which hadn't been there.
Steve, you had a challenge on your hands. You led from vision. Having a strategy was necessary. It was confusing because there were so many different levels of ability in the prison. Places where you're doing really well, places where it was abysmal. And that simple comply, perform, serve, shine strategy meant any area knew what they had to do next. So it simplified it down to start to make sense of the whole situation. The real piece about the dialogue is that it puts staff thinking openly together, transparently, as Jane said. It turns the staff to thinking about what they're really trying to do. And when you engage with the prisoners, it turns them to thinking about why they're in prison and where they need to go. So I took the dialogue right deeply in, but also your strategy. If I'm right, you put it in the steps that led into the prison. So people walked up their strategy physically every day. I mean, how many people think of doing that?
I was thinking about this idea of the cascade, so principal officers and senior officers. I believe they felt a bit special because they were, in a way, being treated like senior managers, come to the table as we plan our strategy for how we're going to do things. You gave individuals specific areas of responsibility for the transformation, not just their normal job responsibility. And sometimes you picked people who others would have said, oh God, no, they're an agitator and they're difficult. It wasn't just pushing information down as a cascade, it was actually bringing them into the leadership.
Did you have a name for them?
You remember they named themselves the cynical old gits. The cogs, we used to call them the cogs, which was lovely because they kind of knew that was about them being aware of their reputation and naming it, but actually making it kind of actually part of their strength. That's because we know we've been around and be part of the relationship.
What you're describing, though, is that every organization has a cynical group of people. That cynical group hold a lot of knowledge and experience, but it's not available. It's hidden behind the cynicism. And if you can crack that, as you did, Steve, it shifts the whole culture. The whole culture becomes available and transparent. You need the dialogue to be able to receive it, both the emotional side, but also to receive the experience and start to draw it together in a useful way. But that was a big contribution of the dialogue in that regard, because then you had the culture shifted on your side. Rather than the anger and resistance, you had people trying to step forward, I believe.
People like Joe Mason and Stuart Blair, who were bringing in new ideas about purposeful activity, education, treatment, resettlement sort of work. And obviously that was at the same time that the prison service was increasing, wanted every prison to have a resettlement unit. And I think their idea and yours was very much that actually resettlement is everybody's job.
Yeah.
It's not just the job of the resettlement unit. So how do we get everybody thinking about that? And the famous story, which I know I've told before about, so that sort of thinking led the prison to also do things that were way beyond what anyone would imagine. And the story about the fish tank in the centre of the prison, in the area that everybody walked past multiple times a day, and Stuart had a fancy tropical fish tank or something put in there. And everyone thought the fish, people would they'll pour bleach into the fish tank, people will eat the fish or they'll get flushed down the toilet, whatever, all the dreadful things that everyone said was going to happen. And it never did. And everyone loved the fish tank and it was well taken care of. And it kind of, in a way, it symbolized something about what was now possible, I think, in the prison. Everything else was changing, but that somehow was like the icing on the cake, that everybody could see that nobody ever imagined would be able to have a fish tank here.
We knew that the prison was under pressure and likely to be closed or privatized. We didn't come just to casually be helpful. We understood the challenge that you had. And the movement of that required quite a number of different things. Not only the right people and the right strategy, but it did require the kinds of conversations that allowed people to change their emotions and change their thinking. And we were concentrating on how do people become accountable for what's happening? How do they become transparent? How do they try to help each other? It was a very fragmented situation, which is quite normal in an organization, to be honest. People don't know what's going on elsewhere. Somehow everybody needed to have a common understanding of where they were going and what they were trying to do. And that common understanding or common sense was what we were really concentrating on. And it doesn't really matter whether you like dialogue or not. The question is, can you be open, honest, transparent, understand each other, respect each other, and move forward? And the answer is clearly you can. So I would never say if somebody doesn't buy into dialogue, that's no good. Did the cynical old gits buy in or not? They bought into a shift, not dialogue, but a shift they wanted to be part of.
I think that's true. I think the other thing is, to go back to what Jane was saying about the fish tank, is that there was a general improvement and a focus on standards and respect.
And it was also about that in relation to what the work of a prison really is. Knowing what the work really is was an important part of that.
So what's your thought about the relevance of this story of HMP Dorchester from 20 years ago? Why is this relevant to people now?
One thing I'd say is that you can transform an organisation without needing extra money or people to work significantly extra hours. I think it's important to understand that in a prison, the senior management team, which is a relatively small proportion, might be there all night because they're passionate and they care. But all the uniformed staff, all the other grades, will clock in and clock out according to their contract. So they were not all working extra, working late, working weekends. They were doing their contracted hours, but they were doing their contracted hours differently. And it transformed the way the prison worked. So I think often people think that if we're to make transformational change, we need lots of extra funding and we need lots of extra people. Actually, no, you can just, within the same funding and people, same constraints, you just change everything that you're doing in the way that we've been describing, and it will transform the organisation.
Shall I add to that, if you're responsible for a prison, it would be helpful to understand a different way of working. And that different way of working involves what you might call dialogic leadership. Leadership with the interest of including and involving others. You can't achieve that without what I call dialogic decision-making. as decision-making, where you include others in the thinking that leads to the decision, and without some dialogic forums where people can be honest and open about their reservations and concerns and aspirations and hopes. And if you have that, you can shift not only the attitude and the thinking, but the culture and the accountability. And it plays out, it proves itself. There's plenty of evidence for that. So anyone involved in prisons, I would be inclined to get hold of Jane and Steve and say, let's talk about this and think about it. But it goes beyond prisons, you know. We have commercial examples of organizations in just the same way. There is a big story here that's not been noticed. And so grateful to take the time with the two of you to make a recording to make it more widely available.